We are providing holistic education by an enriching blend of values and education. Oh, values. Do we all remember our boring moral science lectures? No, no, no. We at Disha have devised interesting methodologies to impart values in a fun activity-based learning. Not only this, Disha has also developed a unique faculty development program, Prerana, a journey from teacher to guru. For the last 15 years, Disha Bharat has touched thousands of teachers and lakhs of students. Out of the past is built the future, says Swami Vivekananda. My Bharat, the online campaign, is undertaken to give the youth of this country its real history. Today being the fourth day of the campaign, we are looking at another fascinating aspect of history, our freedom movement, that is its social agitations. To give this talk to us, we have the amazing Shri Rajat Sethi ji with us. I would like to ask Srimati Kshama Nargam ji, an advocate and a trustee of Disha Bharat, to introduce the speaker to us. Thank you very much, and over to you, Kshama ma'am.
Thank you, Bhavna. Namaste and a warm welcome to all of you viewers for the fourth day of this entire Independence Day celebrations, Independence Fortnight celebrations, I must say. In furtherance of this intellectual quest towards the celebration of independence, we gather here once again for another enriching session. Today, the topic, as already mentioned by Bhavna, is social agitations during freedom struggle. This topic is absolutely unusual, and we have with us the amazing and should I say a person with multifaceted ideas and personality, Shri Rajat Sethi, with us. Shri Rajat Sethi has been, he's intellectually soaring every day to reach newer heights. I must say that I've been following the churn, one of the channels that is being run by Mr. Rajat Sethi and Shubhrasta very closely. And the way the interactions are happening there and the intellectual conversations that are happening there is amazing, and each one of us should actually go and visit there. To introduce Rajat Sethi to us, who is actually not a stranger to Disha because he has already come and addressed us a couple of years back in MLA College. There he has addressed all our volunteers. Just to recollect ourselves, Rajat Sethi ji is a principal advisor to the Chief Minister of Manipur for specifically for the issues of national security and governance. He is a public policy graduate from Harvard University, an alumnus of IIT Kharagpur, and has pursued his management studies from MIT Sloan. He's keen on advising the government on impacting politics, specifically for the Northeast. He has served earlier as an advisor for Jharkhand Chief Minister and has served as a senior fellow in India Foundation. He has co-authored a wonderful book. It's titled The Last Battle of Saraighat, which has been published by Penguin. He is today going to address us on social agitations during the freedom struggle. Now, as we know, that freedom struggle has not been catered to or has not been given to us by certain people or certain personalities whom we are taught. Only when it became a mass movement, only when each person, when the society as a whole started feeling the necessity to free ourselves from the clutches of a foreign rule, that is when the freedom or the idea of freedom was enkindled. Now this, apart from the people, apart from the urban areas, or even, I may not be right in using the word urban, apart from the townships and apart from the well-known cities that we know, there were several struggles that happened amongst the tribals, where the tribals in their small groups decided that they are going to fight against the British. Rajatji is going to be enlightening us on these aspects, the way freedom or the idea of freedom percolated to every small faction of the society. Rajatji, waiting to hear your talks. Over to you. Thank you so much for gracing this, and thank you again, actually, for giving your time to us. A warm welcome to you. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar to all my viewers. A special thanks to the team of Disha Bharat for having me here and speaking as one of the speakers among a list of very senior intellectuals of India. So I really thank you from the bottom of my heart. I also know that Disha Bharat has been working very hard in the state of Karnataka in imparting value-based education to the youngsters of our country. And I believe that knowledge and education without sufficient grounding in values will not result in making of responsible citizens for the nation. So thanks to Disha Bharat for this wonderful work that you have been doing for the past 15 years. So when Disha Bharat approached me, they wanted to discuss on certain dimension of India's freedom struggle, which is largely missing from the books and which our youngsters, the young minds of our country should know about and should understand. In order to address that question, and this is a very wide subject, social agitations, I mean, the entire movement of India's freedom struggle was driven by masses. And most of the leaders didn't had background in politics, etc., and they had all plunged in at a very young age. So what specifically was different about India's freedom struggle, and how did these social agitations start up in its nascent stages is a very interesting subject and a very wide subject. But I will start based on my own personal experiences and my interactions with my grandfather. My grandfather and his forefathers have originally been, they had lived in what is today's Pakistan, in a region called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in a small village called Takhtpadi. In that village, most of the people who were Pashtuns and who had been part of the Khudai Khidmatgar movements of Ghaffar Khan Sahab, and similarly, you've seen a lot of tribal movements over there. I used to ask my grandfather that when you plunged into freedom struggle, you've been working in a very remote corner of the then British India. What motivated you? Delhi was so far away. Or Bengal was supposedly, which was the initial capital of the British Empire, was so far away from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Takhtpadi. So what was his motivation before plunging into this movement against the Britishers? That was something that used to really, interest me, and I wanted to understand what is a common man's thinking about the struggle for India's freedom. Clearly, none of these, the common, so to say, the common masses were aspiring to be some kind of a political leader or gain certain political advantages out of the British movement's failure and then formation of an independent government of India. So when I understood and I tried to interpret what he was trying to mention, I came to this conclusion that a lot of masses, when they plunged into India's freedom struggle, they did not do it for some larger political objective as such. They were fighting against several social malices that existed in the society, and British Empire became a symbol of all the struggles that people were involved in and engaged in. And this is one of the reasons why any small movement in every single district of the British India you would have seen so many such movements. There are thousands and thousands of movements, and without mentioning each one of them, you would rather be belittling the cause of the masses for this movement. But what has happened is, over time, history books have been designed in a way which have done worshipping of individuals and forgot about the subaltern masses which have stood as a force behind the India's freedom movement. As you all know, that the popular history of the freedom movement in India as we all have read it in our college days and before that, have largely glorified by narratives about certain individuals who led certain movements. And this historiography has been inundated by these great leaders, even from regional and national, all kinds of great leaders, and how they fought and they thought about India's Swaraj and India's independence. Now, this kind of history writing, it always tends to privilege an individual as the key shaper of history. And it tends to portray leaders as the representative of the larger nationalistic fervor that was gripping the nation. Clearly, what was missing was the voice of the masses in these books. Now, these narratives of freedom struggle, etc., always subsumed the aspirations and the struggles that these stratified masses in general had and related with the freedom movement with. They had different set of ideas and aspirations, which would rather be wrong to club them together as an homogeneous idea of independence. What masses understood was that they are not in it for any kind of political goals, but they are in there for socio-economic emancipation goals. I'll give you another example. Look at the Congress, the Indian National Congress, right from 1885 till several decades later. If you understand the character of the Congress party, even when it was fighting India's freedom struggle, there have been a lot of research papers which have been written, which say that essentially these were some of these social elites who were members of the Congress party. Even if you look at the district Congress committees spread out across the country, you would see that there were these educated local elites, which were the typical Bhadralok elites of India, which became members of this Congress party and considered Congress as a vehicle for political advancement of the goals. So if you remove few mass leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, etc., from the edifice of Congress, you would essentially be left with certain specific leaders who were becoming presidents over and over again and passing the baton to their sons, etc. So clearly, it was not necessarily an organization which was led by the grassroots movements and grassroots workers, though it was very good at co-opting these movements and merging these movements into their larger freedom struggle for the nation. Now, when I mentioned about this subaltern understanding of India's freedom struggle, there are 3-4 possibly constituents of this subaltern fight. At the foremost are the women, and women, when they fought for their freedom struggle, what were they essentially fighting for? They didn't have suffrage for a very long time. They were clouded by various ill practices in the society. So when they plunged into the freedom movement, it was largely to shackle the chains which were bounding them into the household. They wanted to come out and aggressively come out and fight against the Britishers and show that they were equal to men. So that was a very important element of the subaltern masses fight. And you would have read about several women leaders across the length and breadth of our nation who plunged in and made valuable contributions and provided legitimacy to India's freedom struggle. The next important segment is farmers. And I'm going to dive a little deeper into how the farm struggle started in India and why the meddling of the British Empire into the farm affairs led to disenchantment in the farmers, and then these peasant class revolted against the Britishers. Another thing is laborers. Around the world, there was this movement, the communist movement, and unionism was on the rise. We all know that the Bolshevik movement has happened. In 1925, India's Communist Party had also taken roots in India. It was created in 1925. And gradually we realized that the new industry, the shop floor of this new industry was largely the common labor class which were getting employed in that on that shop floor, were also very important constituents of our freedom struggle. I'll give you one instance. It was later towards the end of our freedom movement around 1930s, when the labor, especially in the Mumbai docks, Mumbai dock was where most of this foreign goods was coming from outside and getting imported into India. These dock workers, they aligned with the nationalistic forces in order to initiate a struggle, a peaceful, non-violent struggle and non-cooperation against the Britishers. Bombay was essentially one of the biggest ports, and Bombay's Dock Workers Union was created in 1932, when the trade unions were actually considered illegal and criminal under the British law. It was then that this dock union was formed. And essentially the objective was how the dock laborers should not cooperate with the Britishers in pushing imported goods into India. And this is how they contributed their voice and their strong support for India's Swadeshi movement. Again, this is one perspective which has been totally usurped by the communists, but you need to understand how the laborers, they united for the cause of the nation. It was not the cause of some kind of, a struggle against the bourgeois, etc. It was essentially a nationalistic fervor amongst the laborers of our country back then, which stood up against some of the ill practices of the British Empire. And last is, of course, the tribals. And tribals of our country provided a very unique and a distinct flavor to our independence struggle. And I mean, tribals have been are spread out across India, right from one corner in the northwest frontier province, which is at the border of modern day Afghanistan and Pakistan. The northwest frontier province and people over there led struggles and were mercilessly killed in several massacres. They were called the Khudai Khidmatgars, right up to central India, which includes the border, the tri-junction of Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh, and also on the borders of Maharashtra, where the Bhil tribes stay and have been living there for generations. Bhil tribes also revolted against the British. If you come on the Madhya Pradesh and today's Jharkhand border, over there you will see the tribals of, there were a few Bhil tribes there also, but along with that, the Santhali tribes and the tribes of the Chota Nagpur Plateau, they raised arms against the Britishers. I will dive a little deeper into what their grievances was. And then you go all the way up to Northeast. And there were several tribal communities in the Northeast, which did not cooperate with the Britishers at all. In fact, some of the biggest struggles that British had to do in order to administer these areas was actually in the Northeast area. The fierce kind of resistance which was shown by the tribals of our country is just phenomenal. And sadly, if you look at our books, you will hardly find any tribal leaders being decorated and being understood and read about the way some of the other leaders are being dealt with in our history books. And this is where I want to bring in my perspective and share with you how these subaltern classes assisted India in its struggle for independence. Now, clearly, this social movement or social agitations is a very broad topic, and we all know that every single movement of India's struggle was not possible without a mass appeal and with involvement of masses across the length and breadth of our country, be it the Swadeshi movement, be it the non-cooperation movement or the civil disobedience movement or the Quit India movement. Everywhere it was strongly supported by the common people of our country. However, there were certain movements which only people who've been localized, who've been suffering because of certain wrong laws being introduced by the Britishers or by the wrong policies of the Zamindari system which they had introduced. And they had these micro struggles happening on a daily basis, which kept the pot boiling for India's struggle that we cannot do or stick with or sustain the British rule anymore. It was a constant struggle which our farmers and tribals and peasant class and labor class provided, which kept the movement on an every single day basis. People did not have to wait for one large movement and then the next large movement in order to fight the freedom struggle. Now, coming to the farmers, we all know that in various places, the Britishers forced the farmers either into indigo cultivation or, which was of course in Champaran, etc. Or it could be in certain places where they stopped farmers from growing what they have been historically growing. For example, in Assam, which is called a Fulagadi Dhava or a Fulagadi revolt, which the farmers did against the Britishers because they stopped them from growing opium. And opium was something which they had been traditionally growing for a very long time. So you will see that when Britishers came out with certain laws, like they had this law where half the produce from the farming labors will have to be shared by with the zamidars. And there was this Teen Bhaga movement which said that only 1/3 of the produce of the farm should be given to the landowners, and 2/3 should be retained by the laborers who are tilling the land and giving their blood and sweat to the crops. So that was a very big movement. It is called the Teen Bhaga movement. And then we also know that there was in Bihar, Swami Sahajanand Saraswati Ji Maharaj, who launched this Bakasht movement around 1930s, where Bakasht movement is all about self-cultivation. And what has happened in the Bakasht lands, Britishers had forcefully removed and evicted these tenants, these laborer tenants, which were cultivating the lands. And then it was being overall handed over to the zamidars. And there was a strong protest coming in from the common farming laborers of the region, especially in Bihar. Post that, this became such a big movement that Bihar's Tenancy Act was launched, was introduced by the Britishers, which did away with this evil practice of handing over the complete rights of the land to zamidars. Now, I mean, there were various other movements even in the south, in Deccan Plateau, etc. Right from even in the Mapila rebellion, if I remember, that was also a rebellion right up in Malabar region in Kerala, which revolted against the moneylenders and the zamindari system, which was introduced over there. Then in Gujarat, we know about Bardoli Satyagraha, where the land revenue on the farmers' land was increased suddenly by almost 25 percentage points, and that was being very strongly resisted by Sardar Patel also. And so on and so forth. There were several such struggles which farmers were leading. The principal cause of concern for the farmers was bonded labor that was being pushed into by certain rules and regulations which the Britishers had put in place. And they were resisting for their rights on the land, on the farming land, and on the produce that was coming based on their hard work. Now, tribals, if I were to delve now deeper into tribal movements, because I wanted to focus on this aspect of the social movement umbrella of Indian independence, then let me tell you that Britishers had a very peculiar attitude towards the tribes. They attributed that the hill tribals, the hill tribe people who are living on hills, are basically savage, and the difference between us versus them was between a savage and a civilized. They said that they are not worthy of governing themselves, and it is the British rule which has to govern them, govern these possibly the unadministrable lands, and provide civilizational values to these people. Now, this became as a cultural conflict between the tribals' own way of living, their own indigenous style of living, vis-a-vis what the Britishers were trying to impose upon them through various missionaries, which are still functional, by the way, till date. Therefore, I will just take you through some of the tribal movements which underpinned our struggle against the Britishers. Some of the very first tribal movements came against the Britishers from the Bhil community. Now, the Bhil tribals are the ones which were, as I told you initially, on the western side of today's Madhya Pradesh, or the central province then. And their basic concern was that their ancestral land, which they call the Khandesh, was being occupied by the Britishers, and it was in defiance against this occupation that they fought a 30-year-long battle. And finally, they were suppressed by various military means, etc. Whereas the Bhils on the Singhbhum area and the Chota Nagpur area, which is the border of Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh today, Singhbhum was also occupied by the British. And then there was this revolts from the Bhils over there around 1820 or 1830, around that time. And there was an extreme military, backlash coming in from the Britishers. They did not consider, they always thought that the tribals are basically the military class, the military race, and they will be very fierce in their struggle. Therefore, Britishers never left any stone unturned with the ferocious kind of a response that they gave on the military side. And they brutally crushed the movements, the initial movements of the tribals. We also know that there were other tribes, even in Gujarat, in northern Gujarat, the Koli tribes are there. They also fought against the Britishers. If I were to take you to the Odia tribes, the Odisha tribes, the Khonds there, the Khondmals, they also revolted. They had two very big revolts against the British. Then we also know about, I've told you, he's the Khasis, which is right now in Madhya Pradesh. The Khasi Hill tribes also had an unsuccessful attempt to drive away Britishers from Meghalaya, from what is today's Meghalaya. It was earlier all Assam. There was no Meghalaya state. It was all of Assam. So they wanted to drive them out of the Khasi Hill. However, all the Khasi senior leadership, the chiefs of the Khasi tribe had all had to surrender. And the Britishers established their rule in Shillong in 1832. And this was also around the Yandabu Treaty, which I will delve if I get time. Then we know that Jharkhand became the symbol of one of the biggest resistance. Both the Santhali tribes on the Rajmahal Hills and the Chota Nagpur tribes, both these tribes in the north and the south of Jharkhand had launched a very, very fierce struggle against the Britishers. And if I were to tell you about one of the most decorated freedom fighter from the modern state of Jharkhand was Bhagwan Birsa Munda. And Bhagwan Birsa Munda had a very, very short span of life. He just lived for 25 years. But keep it in mind that he is one of those leaders, those rare tribal leaders whose portrait adorns the Parliament of India. And not many of us know about what his struggle was against the Britishers. What did he stand for? What was his ideology? And what was he fighting against? In a very, very small town of Khunti in the Chota Nagpur Plateau region. So when common people like Bhagwan Birsa Munda, when he was young, he was barely 10, 15 years, those were his formative years. How did he suddenly become aware of what the Britishers' grand plans were and drew him at such a young age to launch a fierce battle against the Britishers? What were his driving motives behind the whole thing? It's a fascinating thing, and I would urge some of your viewers to read about Bhagwan Birsa Munda and understand what all he stood for. There is this famous saying which reads like this, that Abua Raj Seter Jana Maharani Raj Tundu Jana, which means that let the kingdom of the queen it should be ended, and our kingdom, the kingdom of the tribals, whose lands they've been protecting for generations, that rule should be established. So he was fighting for Swaraj in its own way. But his story is much more interesting, because when he was young and he was in the Khunti district, which is very close to Ranchi, today's Ranchi district, he became the hero of the Munda tribes. And he stood and launched a fierce struggle, which was then all encompassing under the Bengal presidency. And this if I were to mention the year of his struggle, so Birsa Munda was born in 1875 and he died in 1890. So we are talking about really early phases of India's struggle. And how did tribal movement created by Bhagwan Birsa Munda became such a big movement that even till today, a lot of people remember him and worship him. Right from his young days, he was very bright, very energetic, and some of his family members urged him to join the German missionary school. Now, the condition for joining the missionary school back in those days was that you have to get converted into Christianity. And it was a compulsory conversion in order to start your education process. Therefore, Birsa Munda ji converted into Christianity, and he re-christianed himself as Birsa David, which colloquially was called as Birsa Dao. Now, very soon, I mean, barely a few years into his schooling, he understood that this is an alien culture which is being imposed upon the tribals and unknowingly they're falling into the trap. And he said that I cannot continue with this. He took his family into confidence and left not just the school, but also the Christian faith. He left the Christian faith and joined back into the traditional religion of the tribals being practiced in those days. Now that was where, a young boy, 15, 16-year-old boy, going through this churning in his head as to what is happening. How are the German and the Roman Catholic Christian organizations trying to strangulate the cultural freedom of these people, of the tribal people, and how should he resist and revolt against this? Now, as I told you, he moved out. And as soon as he moved out, he launched his own religion, which was, and various adherents, the Orans, the Mundas, etc., joined him, not just in Koti district, but all the neighboring district, and deemed him as a prophet, as a son of the God and a messenger of the God. He positioned himself that the indigenous religion has to be rekindled, and he needs to fight for it, and he will question the movements of the missionaries, the conversions of the missionaries, and he ensured that more than 300, 400 of his brethren, his community, tribal brethren, leave the Christian faith and come back to where their animist religion and indigenous religion was. Now, another thing that happened was, now this is where the cultural angle was there. There was another angle. The other angle was that the British colonial system had intensified the transformation of the tribal agrarian system. Now, tribals basically, they had this primitive technology of tilling their land, cultivating, harvesting, etc. And therefore, they could not generate a lot of farm surplus. The farm produce was very low. And Britishers thought that this is our territory and we need certain specific yields from our farm produce. We cannot be satisfied with these tribals just making subsistence level of produce. So they came out with this very infamous anti-tribal rules and regulations, and in the Chota Nagpur, especially in the Chota Nagpur plateau region, and they introduced what we call as the Thekedari system. So basically, certain Thekedars who were made the owners of tribal land were then bringing in cultivators from outside, and the indigenous tribals were made the lowest among the tribes, and they were called the Rayatars, where their biggest worry was that not just they have lost control over their land, ancestral land, by the way, which they are deeply and emotionally associated with, they have been, their rights on the produce of their forest land has also been snatched away from them. So that came as a very rude jolt for them. And Birsa Munda, and along with his followers, which he called Sardars, they started this fierce movement against this system, that we will not allow our land. And land is one of the most sentimental topics in the tribal rights when we study in Jharkhand. So much so was the agitation. Ultimately, the Britishers got hold of Birsa Munda, and in mysterious circumstances, at the age of 25, he died. But the kind of impact that he left on the minds of our tribal brothers was so deep and so intense that the Britishers understood that the tenancy and these aspects of the Chota Nagpur and the tribal forest is not an easy thing. They cannot come in and have their writ running large on the indigenous people of India. Therefore, they came out with two acts, the SNT and the CPT. SNT is the Santhal Pargana Tenancy Act, and CNT is the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act. Two Tenancy Act to permanently safeguard the lands of the tribals, so that the primary usage, farm produce, the forest produce, all belong to the tribal people. So this was done shortly after the death of Bhagwan Birsa Munda. And it was a success of Birsa Munda, which was so profound. It left such a profound impact on these people that even till today, I'll just give you an instance, that BJP, which was ruling in this state of Jharkhand, tried tinkering with the CNT and SPT acts. and the tribals of that state, strongly resisted that, so much so that they throughout the BJP government also, just because they had touched upon something which was so sacrosanct. It was their CNT and SPT Act. So I would urge the young viewers there to study about Bhagwan Birsa Munda. Why is he one of the most strongest personalities of India's freedom struggle, which brings a very unique character to the struggle. Another thing which I wanted to highlight which is generally missing is the Northeast. Now, Northeast, we all know, even in our collective imagination, even till date, we always understand that it's one bloc which has a lot of separatist movement, a lot of insurgency movement, but we forget that there has been persistent struggle for India's freedom, even emanating from the Northeast part of our country. And we should embrace them. We should talk about it more and more, so that whatever alienation that exists between one part of our country and the other part should go away with. So this is where I wanted to highlight how some of the tribal movements fought against the British imperialism in the Northeast region. One thing which is one of the most fiercest struggle initiated by the tribes was done by the Kukis. Now, Kuki is a tribe which belongs to the broader family of Chin, Kuki Chin tribe, which inhabits in the northern territory of Myanmar and on borders of India, which includes in Manipur and in Mizoram. That is where this tribe is located in. And they very ferociously fought against the British in 1917 around the First World War. And what was the reason? Kuki chiefs, the village heads of this tribe, Kuki tribe, they refused to join the Imperial Army Labor Corps. This was a unit which was set up by the Britishers around the First World War to basically do the menial job on the battleground. Menial job as like digging pits, digging trenches, moving around dead bodies, animal carcasses and all. So some of the filthiest works were being assigned to this labor corps. And all the tribals which were considered to be very fit, the Naga tribes and the Kuki tribes, were being drafted into this labor corps. And there was this stiff resistance coming in, so much so that people call that as a war. It is called as an Anglo-Kuki war between the Britishers on one side and the Kuki tribes on the other side. So much was a struggle that they were supposed to hire around 2,000 people from the state of Manipur, but they ended up hiring only a few people who decided to join for some reasons. Otherwise, this 2-year-long battle gave the Britishers a bloody nose. They understood that the tribal population, the tribal communities of the Northeast cannot be taken lightly. And therefore, this perception among the Britishers became very, very strong that it is very difficult to administer either the Naga tribes or the Kuki tribes or even the Manipuri people, the Meitei people, that for any small agitation, they used to unleash battalions and battalions of Assam Rifles to crush it and nip it in the bud, so that if any of these movements become big, it will be virtually impossible for the Britishers to resist against. There was another very famous freedom fighter, which we should all know about, is Rani Gaindelu. Now, Rani Ma belonged to a Naga tribe. She was a Kabui, belonging to the Zelirong tribal class, which had 3-4 tribes under it. And Kabui was one of the tribes. She was barely 13 years of age. Mind you, she was a very young girl at the age of 13 when she plunged herself in the freedom struggle, and in a very unique and a different cultural way. Now, we all know that how the Naga tribes, and Naga is not one monolithic community. There are very small tribes, around 30 odd Naga tribes within this broad definition of Naga, which were all essentially village-based tribes, warring tribes fighting against each other. And they were supposedly civilized, in the missionary words, by the American Baptists. So American Baptists from the region of Boston came all the way to India for the missionary work in Nagaland. What is today we know as Nagaland, back then it was not called Nagaland. It was just called the Northeast Frontier Provinces and some of the highlands, the hill tribes of Assam. Over there, the struggle was that, Britishers had an incentive because through their Catholic movement in Kolkata and the British Baptist movement, they wanted to convert and supposedly civilize the tribes, the Naga tribes. And most of them got converted into Christianity. However, Rani Gaindalu, she was steadfast that we need to go back to our own traditional indigenous way of living life, which entails, this Hiraka was one of this religion, animist religion, which used to be practiced in among her tribal colleagues and community. She said that instead of adopting Christianity, I am better off going and taking and ensuring that all my community people go back to their original traditional religions. Mind you, she was just 13, coming from a very poor family, just one of those masses. Still till date, the district where she came from, today it is called Tamenglong district. It is part of Manipur. And that district is one of the poorest districts of India. She belonged to that region, had virtually no connections with the rest of the India or even understanding the larger gamut of India's freedom struggle. But she took it upon herself to pick a micro issue which was central to that community and transformed it into a spiritual social political movement under the umbrella of the Hiraka movement, that I will resist any kind of British influence into our way of life. Then she also realized that the Britishers were against any kind of political organization of the Zeliorong tribes, and they were ready to very steadfastly oppose Rani Gaindalu when she, through her guerrilla warfare, gathered 300 to 400 tribesmen of her own community to form a small militia to fight against the Britishers in those regions of Manipur and Nagaland. So fierce were some of these tribal guerrilla warfare that Britishers were always defeated and always kept chasing her. And when she was young, 16, 17 years of age, she was running from one hill to another hill and ensuring that she's never caught by the Britishers. She ultimately, at the age of 16, she was arrested. And arrested not by, in a battleground or anything of that sort, but she was just trying to build a wooden fortress for herself, along with the help of her people from her community, that she was ambushed and by no less than 2 battalions of Assam Rifles, which marched up to her native village. And without much resistance, she surrendered. And at the age of 16, she was put behind prison in Assam jail. That was in 1932. When she was 16, she ended up over there. And even when she was in jail, her movement continued pretty vigorously. She launched a staunch resistance against the conversion of Nagas into Christianity. And it is for this reason that even the Nagas disown her. Nagas say that no, she doesn't belong to our community. If she is constantly campaigning for stopping Christian conversion, then she doesn't belong to us, and we will not support her. We will not do any advocacy for her. So she was pretty much left on her own. She also ensured that the Zeliong tribe is not being exhorted on paying taxes, unreasonable amount of taxes. And therefore, she was able to collect all donations and build a very, very strong guerrilla army in those regions. And she kept evading arrest till at the age of 16 years, she finally got arrested. 5 years later, Jawaharlal Nehru in 1937 came to Shillong and met her in Shillong jail. It was there that this title of Rani was given. She was not a Rani or anything of that. She was not a queen, but that was a title which was given to her because she so steadfastly fought for the rights of the traditional indigenous rights of her people. Jawaharlal Nehru promised that he is going to ensure the early release of Rani Gaindalu, who was arrested on life imprisonment. on charges of murder and planning sedition against the British rule. He tried writing to British members of parliament, especially Lady Astor, asking her to release Rani Gaindulu on humanitarian concerns, but the Secretary of State of India back then rejected the request of Nehru, and Rani wasn't released. She was only released after India's independence was secured in the year of 1946-47. Now, why are some of these individuals, and both, by the way, Birsa Munda ji and Rani Gaindulu, both of these people were very, very young, ambitious, idealist youngsters of India who launched this massive struggle and became symbols of resistance against the Britishers and outsiders occupying their rights, their indigenous way of style, their living, their lands, etc. And that was basically the symbol of the tribal resistance against the British Raj in India. I will pause here and I will try and address your question, but just to give an overall encompassing idea about what I touched upon today was that, number one, India's freedom struggle was fought not just by individual leaders whom we all read in the history books, but it is also fought by common people, common masses, and the subaltern class who basically had no political clout, who had no political ambitions. They were fighting for their social and economic emancipation. They were fighting against the struggles, against some of the wrongful laws and wrongful systems which were introduced by the Britishers, which meddled into their day-to-day life. That is what they were fighting against. And in that fight, not just the women, the peasants, the labor community and the tribals, all of this segment of people joined hands together, and they were fighting their micro battles and ensuring that Britishers on an everyday basis felt the heat of India's struggle and India's genuine aspiration for freedom. That's how India's freedom struggle should be remembered as, and that is why young friends should study more and more about these subaltern fights of our struggle. Thank you very much. Namaskar. Bharat Mata ki Jai. I'm now open to taking a few questions. Some of you who might have questions, you can ask me in the comment section on your Facebook page.
Thank you so much, Rajat ji. It was a fascinating talk indeed. I am sure all of us didn't move an inch and we were also glued to what you had to tell us. I do have a few questions which we have got on our from our live viewers. Can I? Yeah? Okay. So the first question is like this. When the Indian history textbooks were written, it is still not comprehensive. Many social agitations like the ones you mentioned are not known. Even today, it remains unknown. So the justice has not been given to the contributions of tribals across Indian freedom movement. The question is this selective narration of history or purposeful negligence or a conspiracy by British and a few Indian intellectuals?
That's a brilliant question. And I think it requires an academic research as to where did our historians and history book writers went wrong. Why did they betray some of the very genuine voices against the British rule in India? And why did they never find space? They used to, I mean, when I read my history book, I remember that they used to club all of the peasant movement together, gave us these headlines that these were some of the headings, and gave these peculiar names to each of these movements, and their job was done. They never really made us understand as students how difficult was a common man's fight. For leaders, they have, they can mobilize masses at any moment, and the fight for them had lesser stakes as compared to the stakes of the masses. Then why should we not hero worship some of these leaders who have never found place? And some of the reasons is, of course, intellectual dishonesty. Some of the historians which have been pampered by specific regimes after India's independence deliberately did not give credence to some of these mass movements. It was Rani Gaindulu, like movements like this, which I think it took 50, 60 years for the government to, understand in around 1982 when Padma Bhushan was given to her. And the reason being that over the period of time, history books remain themselves condensed around hierarchy of, one chapter of Congress party to the other chapter, to the next chapter, etc. All we are aware, our history books are tied around various conventions, national conventions of the Congress party. Is this justified? If you look at right from, our history book started 1885 when we are dealing about India's freedom struggle from how Vomesh Banerjee started Congress party, and it was a safety wall of sorts, and they just do away with what was happening in the late 19th century, around 1875 to 1900. That was a formative years of India's structured movement for freedom struggle. But we were completely devoid of those data points. We were only showcased that this is how you need to memorize Congress's history, because you all need to remember, because you are going to be slaves of Congress forever. And this is where my principal disagreements come in the history writing that we have been made victims of. And we should therefore struggle on our individual basis to fight against this apartheid, which has been practiced in the history books, of only worshipping political leaders and not worshipping the masses, who stood and sacrificed much, much, much more than what the leaders sacrificed for.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much for that clarification. We really need to give, like you said, voice to the masses. Hopefully it will be done. We have another interesting question here. The second question is like this. The social agitations were issue-based many times, like Quit India, non-cooperative movement, Bengal unification, and etc. How would you analyze these social agitations and its collateral benefits in social reforms within our society?
So you mentioned about Bengal?
Quit India, non-cooperative movement, and the Bengal unification. And how did these social agitations, how would we analyze these social agitations and its collateral benefits to social reforms within our country?
Yeah, see, this is also an important thing. Ultimately, Quit India movement and those movements, those mass movements, which were in the last decade for us of our struggle, had a very different contour. There was a very high sense of urgency. As compared to the earlier decades of struggle, where the biggest issue or concern in front of our freedom fighters was how to keep the flame burning, and how to keep the flame burning on a sustained basis for years and years with no sight of India's freedom in light. There was no light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of our freedom strugglers. But towards the last decade, there was, it was a foregone conclusion that India would be liberated. The question was when, and therefore there was this extreme sense of urgency among the masses, among the ruling class, everyone, that it is now or never, it is do or die, and we need to do everything and put in all our might, all our collective strength to evict the Britishers from India. That is how the tone and tenor changed. And of course, Quit India movement and the mass mobilization that was there in right from 40s, 42 till the drafting, when the drafting started happening around India Independence Act, or even before that, when the cabinet was sending their missions to study how to further liberate India. So in my view, that was also a very, very interesting and an important time. That was a time when finally the idea of division of India was crystallized, because even the Muslims asserted through Muslim League, they asserted very strongly for an independent nation that not just separate electorate would do, they would rather want an independent nation. And that idea was being sown into the minds of one community over and over again by a very aggressive stand taken by the Muslim League. So Muslim League and its own aggression and its mass movement of Muslims in that phase also is very important, and that basically designed the course of how India would be liberated and at what cost, and what would be the future consequences of it. Congress also was in a hurry. I initially mentioned around Khudai Khidmatgars who were led by Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in modern day Pakistan. They were very important constituents. In fact, the Northwest Frontier province had to actually do a referendum because most of the political leaders wanted to stick around with India. But Congress in a hurry, Congress party who then had to, take the decision of whether to split the country or not, was in a hurry not to take them on board. And they were such an important constituent of our freedom struggle, bringing in the Pashtuns on side of India against the Britishers. But Congress in its hurry didn't even consult them and said that, okay, you guys do a referendum and decide on your own what you want to do if you want to merge into Pakistan. And this is what Khan Sahab then said, that you have left us to the wolves. That was his words. And that is such a glaring thing to know, that when we could have worked together and averted India's partition, our leaders in somewhat of a hurry to change political hands of power from one hand to the other hand, they did away with some of the India's long-term interests also.
Yes, the story of partition and what it has brought to us is, I think we are all still living some of the effects of the partition. Indeed. Yes, one final question. Northeast India's social agitations during the freedom movement is lesser known. What should be the efforts to bring those untold stories to the forefront and to get a prominent place in academics and make it known to the rest of the country? You told about so many of the Northeast agitations, which many of us did not know. So how do we bring it to the forefront?
I think first of all, the current intellectuals should start writing popular stories about their contribution of the Northeasterners in India's freedom struggle. First of all, popular stories have to come out. Gradually, when academic debates happen over them and they become more structured, those stories become more structured, will they be incorporated into our academic books? So I think we are way far behind the ultimate goal of having history books, academic history books, which do justice to every single constituent of our freedom struggle. However, it is the responsibility of each one of us who have been authors, who have written books, to continue writing about the Northeast, to ensure that every single small and big story is being published by mainstream publishers, not just by some unknown publisher, because then that will have distribution challenges. Therefore, important stories have to be not recounted one or two times, but several times, so that it becomes part of our collective conscience. I'll give you an example. When I was writing this book around the last Battle of Saraighat, nobody knew what the Battle of Saraighat was. Nobody knew who Lashit Barphukan was and what kind of a struggle he, from the Brahmaputra Valley, he forged against or fought against the army of Aurangzeb. So these stories, Mughals had a very vast, very all-encompassing empire in our country, but they were never able to touch the Brahmaputra Valley or even cross the Brahmaputra Valley. Why was that? Where was the struggle coming in from? So those were the stories which were never being discussed, and over the course of time, from 1950s, 60s, 70s, during those decades, some of the literature which was published by the insurgents, the people who were separatists, who wanted to separate Northeast from India, those people started further ignoring the contribution of the Northeastern people, our brothers from Northeast, into India's struggle for independence. Deliberately, this was done. And I can go on and on around various literatures with either the ULFA or the NSCN or the NNC, and all of these people, they kept deliberately removing certain references of the contribution of the Northeast into any academic books. So even what happened was that because of lack of support from these separatist movement leaders, no mainstream academician took the pains of going there, researching, bringing those stories out and incorporating into books. That's what has happened now, is that now people can travel, it's much more safer. There are all of these separatist movements are now in talks with the government of India, most of them. And now there is opportunity for us to turn back the old pages of history books and try and bring the information, nuggets of information that are there into the present context, and let our country and our people and our citizens know the enormous contribution of those people to initiate a very fierce, very fierce struggle, which Britishers even for very long time dreaded, that any kind of disturbance in the Northeast will be very difficult for them to quell. So it's our duty to learn about it and to keep reading more and more books. So authors have to write books and viewers have to read books. That's how we can bring it to mainstream.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rajat ji. It was indeed a fascinating talk. Through your talk, we got to know that there's so much more to know, so much more to the social agitations of the freedom movement. And like our Prime Minister rightly says, we need to do Sabka Saath and Sabka Vikas, at least bring them on to the mainstream. So with this, we would like to once again thank Shri Rajat Sethi ji for being with us and giving his valuable time to us. Before we end the session, I would like to give our viewers a quick view of what we have in store tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, as usual, the student programs will continue at 11 a.m. and the hero of our programs then will be none other than Shri Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who gave us the Vande Mataram. And in the evening, same time, 6 o'clock at the Disha Bharat Facebook page, we shall be having another fascinating talk by Shri V. Nagaraj ji, Swatantra Sangrama Mattu Rashtra Bhava Jagarana. What a better day to have it than August 5th, when we will be celebrating the Ram Janmabhoomi, the rise of Lord Sri Ram again. And in the evening, we will see the rise of nationalism in the words of Shri V. Nagaraj ji. Thank you very much, all the viewers, for your valuable time and listening to us. And thanks once again to Shri Rajat Sethi ji for his wonderful, enlightening talk. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.